The old man sat on his porch rocking back and forth in the same creaky chair he'd owned for years, his wrinkled hands gripping the armrests as he stared up at the night sky. It was quiet, too quiet, like the world was holding its breath. The stars blinked down at him, distant and indifferent, and he sighed, thinking about how small and slow his life had become. Once he had been strong, once he had been a man who built things, who mattered, but now he was just waiting for time to run out. Then it happened. A streak of brilliant silver light tore across the sky, moving too fast, too bright to be a plane or a meteor. It sizzled through the atmosphere, leaving a glowing trail before crashing down in the woods behind his house. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and a shockwave of wind rustled through the trees, knocking over his empty beer bottle. It rolled off the porch and into the dirt. But he barely noticed. His heart was hammering in his chest, his old instincts kicking, and he reached for his flashlight, fumbling with it for a moment before heading toward the woods, curiosity overriding the aches in his knees. The forest was dark, thick, with the scent of pine and damp earth. He moved carefully, stepping over roots and fallen branches, his flashlight beam cutting through the shadows, when he saw a crater still steaming in the clearing, the ground scorched black, and in the center a figure striving to rise. She was unlike anything he had ever seen, tall and slender, with skin that shimmered like liquid silver. Her long dark hair clung to her face, matted with sweat or something else, and her eyes, huge and filled with desperation, locked onto him as she stumbled forward. "Help me, please," she gasped, her voice strange, but somehow familiar, as if it bypassed his ears and went straight into his mind. She took another step, then collapsed onto the ground, her strange armor cracked and leaking a glowing blue fluid that hissed as it touched the dirt. The old man stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. Was she real? Was he dreaming this? But then she let out a low moan of pain, and instinct took over. He rushed to her side, his hands hovering over her, unsure of what to do. "It's okay," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "You're safe now." He gently turned her onto her back. Her breathing was shallow and ragged, and her skin felt too cold. Even though she looked almost human, he could tell she was something else, something not of this earth. She grabbed his wrist with surprising strength, her fingers trembling. "You must help me. They are coming." Her gaze darted past him toward the dark tree line, and he followed it, his gut twisting with unease. The night felt heavier, now the silence unnatural. "Who's coming?" he asked, but she only shook her head, trying to sit up before falling back again. He had no idea what to do, but leaving her here alone in this state didn't seem right. With a grunt, he slid his arms under her, lifting her up. She was lighter than she looked, but something about her presence felt heavy, as if she carried the weight of something far greater than he could understand. He carried her back through the trees, his steps quicker, now driven by something more than curiosity. By the time he reached his porch, sweat dripped down his brow, and his old joints ached. But he didn't stop, not until he had laid her down on the couch inside the dimly lit living room. He took a step back, wiping his hands on his jeans, his eyes scanning her strange armor, the deep cracks glowing with that eerie blue liquid. Whatever she was, whoever she was, she needed help. But from what he wasn't sure, she stirred again, her voice weak yet insistent. "Please, you must listen to me. They are here. They will come for me, for the artifact, for everything." He frowned, his mind spinning. Artifact? What artifact? He sat down heavily in the chair beside her, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Lady, I don't know who you are or what you're talking about, but it looks like you need rest." He reached for an old blanket, draping it over her small frame, even though he had no idea if she needed warmth. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending a chill down his spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. Something was coming, something was out there watching, waiting. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something stir inside him, something he thought he had lost long ago, a purpose. The alien woman lay still on the couch, her breathing steadying, but the tension in the room only grew stronger. The old man sat in the chair across from her, his mind racing. Too many questions, too many unknowns. He didn't know how to help her, what she wanted from him, or what was happening. All he knew was that the night had become far too strange to ignore. His eyes flickered to the window every few seconds, as if expecting to see something out there lurking in the shadows. He leaned forward, looking at her closely, trying to find any hint of what she was or where she came from. After a long moment, her eyes opened slowly, the silver hue in them even more pronounced now. She turned her head towards him, her voice barely a whisper. "They are coming for me. They will stop at nothing to find me. You must help me." She repeated the words with such urgency it was impossible to ignore. He felt his heart skip a beat. As he leaned in closer, he could see the faintest flicker of fear in her eyes, despite the alien calmness of her features. And he knew then that whatever she was facing was bigger than anything he could have imagined. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice low and steady, but the question seemed to hang in the air heavy and unspoken. The woman's expression shifted slightly as if the answer was something she had been avoiding. Her lips parted, but it took a few moments before she spoke. "They are not like us," she said, her voice stronger, now colder. "They are hunters. They track and destroy. They will not rest until they find me. And when they do, it will be the end of everything. They will stop at nothing." The old man stood up, pacing the room, his mind scrambling to put the pieces together. He thought of all the strange things that had happened over the years, of whispers he had heard in dark corners of government buildings, of rumors about technology too advanced for any of the countries on Earth to have developed. He remembered the reports he had read long ago, the ones that spoke of strange objects and encounters that never made it into the public eye. It was all starting to make sense in a way that he didn't want it to. "But why me?" he asked, his voice rough with disbelief. "Why come to me? Why not someone else, anyone else?" The woman's eyes locked onto his, her gaze sharp and intense. "Because you have seen it before," she said. "You have touched the power buried here, the power that can change everything. And they know you were once part of it. You were once involved in the project. It's why they are hunting you too. They think you know something that could stop them." He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The project, the old files that he had buried long ago, the ones he thought were forgotten, the ones that had changed the course of his life and his country's future. He remembered the secrecy, the lies, the people who vanished without a trace, and the strange artifact he had seen in the reports all those years ago. It had to be connected, it had to be. "I haven't been part of that for decades," he said, his voice shaking slightly, the memories like ghosts rising up in his mind. "I left it all behind. I don't want any part of it anymore." "You don't have a choice," she replied, her tone soft but firm. "They will come for you whether you want to be involved or not. They know you know something, and they will take you if they have to." He looked down at her, his mind still reeling, trying to make sense of it all. She was right. He couldn't deny it. There was no turning back now. No ignoring what was happening around him. The weight of his past and the present were colliding with an intensity that left him breathless. He had thought his life was over, that his time had passed. But now he was standing at the edge of something much bigger than himself. "They're coming," she said urgently, her voice growing stronger with each word. "We don't have much time. We have to find it before they do." "Find what?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The artifact, the one they're hunting," she said. "It's hidden here on Earth, and you know where it is." He felt a chill creep down his spine as the pieces began to click into place. The artifact he had seen mentioned in those old reports, the one that had been lost all those years ago, hidden away beneath the Earth's surface. And now she was telling him it was the key to stopping whatever was coming. He felt a surge of fear, but also something else, something he hadn't felt in years: determination. "We need to move now," she urged, her voice shaking with urgency. "There is no time to waste." He looked at her for a long moment, taking in the fear in her eyes, the weight of her words, the responsibility that now rested on him. He had no choice but to act. And even though he wasn't sure what he was getting into, he knew there was no turning back now, not when the fate of everything rested in his hands. The old man stood frozen for a moment, his mind spinning as her words echoed in his ears. The artifact hidden beneath the earth, the thing they were both desperately searching for, the thing that had the power to change everything. He looked at the alien woman, her silver eyes locked on his with a quiet intensity that told him she was telling the truth. The weight of it all pressed down on him like a heavy stone, and for the first time in years, he felt the cold grip of fear tighten in his chest. It wasn't just the artifact, it was everything that came with it: the government, the hunters, and whatever other forces were in motion, things that he had long since pushed from his mind, things he thought he had buried. But the past had a way of resurfacing. When you least expected it, he swallowed hard, trying to focus. The time for hesitation had passed. "I don't even know where to start," he muttered, pacing the room. He couldn't do this alone, he couldn't do this at all. The idea of digging up the past made him feel sick. But he didn't have a choice. He had to help her, not just because she was pleading with him, but because he knew deep down that if he didn't, the world as he knew it could end. "We have to find it before they do," she said, her voice breaking through his thoughts. "The artifact is the key to stopping them. You were once part of the team that studied it. You know where it is. I can feel it. I know you do." He shook his head and stopped pacing, taking a deep breath, his hands trembling as the memories flooded back. A government project from decades ago, classified higher than anything he'd ever imagined. A small group of scientists and engineers working in the shadows on technology that was far beyond anything they had ever seen. He had been one of them back then, young, ambitious, believing they were doing something good, something right. But then it had all gone wrong, so wrong. The artifact was too powerful, too dangerous. And they knew they couldn't control it, so they hid it, buried it deep beneath the earth, and erased all records of it. They didn't want anyone to find it ever again. "It's not here," he said, his voice low and filled with regret. "They took it somewhere else. After the project was shut down, they didn't leave a trace. They made sure no one could ever access it." The woman looked at him with disbelief. "But you know where it is, don't you? You know where they took it, don't you?" He hesitated for a long time, but finally nodded slowly. The project had been dismantled years ago, after it was deemed too risky, even by the highest levels of government. The artifact had been sealed away in a black site, a place so secret that even he hadn't been allowed to know its location, but he knew someone who had taken part in the final decision to move it. "They moved it to a facility in the mountains," he said quietly, "but it's been years. No one's been there since they sealed it up. They made sure no one could get close." But the woman's gaze didn't waver. "We have to go there," she said firmly. "We don't have a choice. We can't let them find it first." He felt his chest tighten at the thought of returning to that place. The memories of the black site still haunted him, the cold concrete walls, the security protocols, a secrecy. It was a place designed to keep everything locked away, and the thought of breaking into it now seemed impossible. But he had no choice. The world was changing faster than he could keep up, and the stakes had never been higher. "I can't do it alone," he said, looking at her. "We have to find someone who can help us." She nodded. "Yes, we need allies, but we don't have much time." He took a deep breath and turned toward the door. It was time to go back to the one place he swore he would never return, to the place where everything had started, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the hunters were already closer than they knew. The race had begun, and it was a race they couldn't afford to lose. The old man stood in the doorway for a moment, staring out into the night. The world seemed strangely quiet now, even though the tension in the air was palpable. He knew they didn't have much time. The hunters were out there somewhere, and every second wasted could bring them closer to the artifact, closer to ending everything. The woman stirred on the couch behind him, her silver eyes watching him intently, as if she could read his every thought. He turned around and looked at her, his mind racing, thinking of the black site, the facility high in the mountains that held the answers they needed. But getting there wouldn't be easy. The roads were heavily guarded, and he knew there were few people left who could even get close to the place without being caught. The memories of his past dealings with the site still haunted him, but he couldn't afford to let fear stop him now. "Who can help us?" he asked, his voice low and steady, though he felt anything but calm. The woman's gaze never left his face as she thought for a moment. "There is a man," she said, "a former operative who was part of the team that secured the facility when it was first constructed. He knows the security systems, he knows the location of the secret entrances, and he is someone you trust." He frowned. "Trust? I haven't spoken to that man in over a decade." He said he disappeared after the project was shut down. No one has heard from him since. "He is still alive," she said. "I can sense it. He is your only chance." The old man felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew who she was talking about. The operative was a man named Jack Ellis, a former military contractor who had worked on numerous high-level government projects before vanishing without a trace after the artifact was moved to the black site. They had been close once, but time had passed and things had changed. The old man wasn't sure he wanted to dredge up those old ties, but he also knew that the woman was right. They couldn't do this alone. He ran a hand through his thinning hair and took a deep breath. There was no avoiding it now. He had to find Jack Ellis. And if the woman was right, if he could still be trusted, then they had a chance to reach the facility before the hunters found them. "We leave at first light," he said, his voice firm and determined. The woman nodded. "But I must warn you," she said, "the hunters are not like anything you've encountered before. They are relentless, and they have resources far beyond anything your government can comprehend. You may think you are safe, but you are not. They will find you." The old man didn't need to hear any more. He had already made up his mind. They had to move fast, and they had to be smart. He grabbed his jacket and pulled it on the fabric, worn but familiar, his fingers brushing the old insignia on the sleeve, a reminder of who he once was before everything had changed. "We will get there," he said, more to himself than to her. "We will find Jack, and then we'll go to the facility together. And no more hiding, no more running. We take it back. We take the power back." She looked up at him, her silver eyes softening for a moment before hardening again. "But there is more than just the artifact," she said. "Its power has the potential to change everything. It can heal or destroy. It can bring salvation or doom. You must understand this power is not something to be taken lightly." "I understand," he said, his voice steady, though the weight of her words settled deep in his chest. He had lived through enough to know that power in the wrong hands could destroy everything. The temptation to use it could be overwhelming, and he wasn't sure he was strong enough to resist. With a final glance at the woman, he turned and stepped outside into the cool night air, his breath visible in the dim light of the porch. He glanced up at the sky once more before turning back to the road ahead. It was a long drive to the mountains, and he had no idea what would await them when they arrived. But he knew one thing: they had no choice but to go through with it. They had to reach the facility before the hunters did. The woman followed him out, and they both climbed into his old truck, the engine sputtering to life as he put the vehicle into gear and began to drive the road ahead, winding through the small town and out into the wilderness, the trees thick on either side and the road barely visible under the cover of night. They drove in silence, but the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, the weight of what they were about to do hanging over them. It would be a long drive, and even longer if they didn't make it before the hunters found them. The old man kept his hands firmly on the wheel and his eyes on the road ahead, but his mind was racing at full speed with each mile they put between themselves and the town. He wondered what would be waiting for them at the end of the journey, and if they would get there in time to stop the coming storm. The truck rumbled down the darkened road, the headlights cutting through the thick forest. Ahead, the old man's hands gripped the steering wheel tight as they drove further away from everything he had known. The further they went, the more his unease grew. The silence between them was heavy, his thoughts a whirlwind of doubt and uncertainty. The road seemed endless, winding and twisting through dense trees that loomed like silent watchers on either side. He could feel the weight of the journey pressing down on him with each passing mile. The woman sat beside him, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, her expression unreadable, but he could sense the tension radiating from her, even as she remained still. Her presence in the truck felt like a storm waiting to break. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The hair on the back of his neck prickled every time they passed a dark stretch of road, every time the wind rustled through the trees, as if something out there knew they were coming. The silence stretched on until finally the woman spoke, her voice low but urgent. "We are close," she said quietly. "You know where Jack Ellis is. You must get him before they do." He glanced at her out of the corner of his eye. "We don't even know if he's still alive," he muttered, his voice tinged with frustration. But the woman's gaze never wavered, her eyes burning with an intensity that made him feel small and insignificant. "You know he is still alive," she said with a certainty that left no room for doubt. "Trust me, you have to find him." He grunted, his foot pressing harder on the gas pedal as they pushed deeper into the wilderness. They had a long way to go, but he could feel the time slipping away, and he knew they couldn't afford to waste any more of it. They needed Jack Ellis, and they needed him now. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly, the darkness swallowing them up as they left the main road and began to climb the winding mountain path. The truck's tires screeched against the gravel as they veered around sharp corners, the air growing colder as they ascended into the higher elevations. The trees thinned out as they reached the foothills, and the road ahead became more treacherous. The truck bumped and jolted over the rough terrain, but the old man pushed forward, determined to reach their destination. "It's up ahead," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We are close." The old man didn't answer, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, the headlights illuminating the steep incline that led them to the top of the mountain. He knew Jack Ellis had a cabin somewhere up here, a secluded place far from prying eyes, where he could hide from the world and the government that had once employed him. But even with that knowledge, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were too late. When they reached the clearing at the top of the mountain, the truck came to a stop, the engine sputtering. As they finally arrived at Jack's cabin, it was dark and quiet, but the lights inside flickered faintly in the windows like a distant beacon. The old man took a deep breath and stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching against the gravel as he approached the door, the cabin in his hand, hesitating over the doorknob. "You have to trust me," she said softly, her voice steady, but filled with urgency. "He is here, he is waiting for you." He nodded, but it was hard to shake the feeling that they weren't alone. As he reached for the door, his eyes scanned the shadows just beyond the cabin, as if expecting something or someone to jump out at him. But the night remained still, no movement, no sound, just the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. With a steady hand, he knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. It wasn't long before the door creaked open, just a crack, a figure standing in the darkness. Behind it, the silhouette of a man who looked older than the last time the old man had seen him, but still unmistakably Jack Ellis, his face lined with years of hiding from the world. "You shouldn't be here." Jack's voice was rough, his eyes scanning the forest behind them, before settling on the woman standing just behind the old man. "We don't have time for questions," the old man said. "We need your help now." Ellis's eyes flickered toward the woman, his expression hardening, as if recognizing something he didn't want to see. "You brought her here," he said, his voice cold, but there was a trace of fear in his eyes. "She is the only chance we have," he said urgently. "They're coming for us, Jack. They're coming for the artifact, and they won't stop until they find it. We need your help to get to the facility." Jack looked between them, his jaw tightening, as he weighed his options before finally stepping aside. "To let them in. I never wanted any part of this again," he muttered, "but it looks like you've dragged me back into it." The door closed behind them with a soft thud, and the old man knew they were out of time. The race to the facility had begun, and there was no turning back now. The cabin was small, but well kept, a stark contrast to the wild isolation surrounding it. The air inside was heavy with the scent of old wood and something faintly metallic. Jack Ellis led them into the dimly lit room, his movements cautious, his eyes darting toward the windows, as if expecting someone to be watching them at any moment. The old man took in the familiar surroundings, his mind racing as he took in the maps and old military gear scattered about the room. This was the man who knew the way to the facility, the man who could help them get past the hunters, but there was no mistaking the tension in the air. Jack closed the door behind them with a finality that made the old man feel like they were already trapped inside. He could see the wariness in Jack's face, the scars of a life spent, running from the past, the guilt that hung heavy in his eyes as he turned to face them. "This is crazy," Jack said, his voice low and rough as he ran a hand through his graying hair. "I thought we were done with all this. It's too dangerous. You can't go back then. Not now, not with them hunting for it." "We don't have a choice," the woman said, her voice calm, but filled with an urgency that left no room for argument. Jack's eyes flicked to her, then back to the old man, as if weighing the situation. He didn't want to be here, he didn't want to help them, but deep down the old man knew that Jack had always had a soft spot for him, even if their paths had parted long ago. "What are we supposed to do?" he asked. "There's no way to get past the security they set up. We can't just waltz into the place." "We have a way," Jack Ellis said, his voice grim. "We know the back entrances, we know the weak points in their system. But even with that, getting in won't be easy. And once we're inside, there's no guarantee we'll make it out alive. The hunters are smarter than you think. They've been watching the facility for months, if not longer." The old man clenched his fists at his sides. "So what do we do now?" Jack paused for a long moment, looking between the two of them before he finally sighed and reached for a map on the table. He spread it out in front of them, pointing to a small mountain range on the map. "The black site is hidden somewhere in these mountains," he said quietly. "But the entrance is locked down tighter than anything we've dealt with. Before getting in, we'll take precision and speed. The moment we breach it, they'll know, and then it's a race to the artifact." "We can do it," the woman said. She stepped closer to the map, tracing her fingers along the lines. "We have to get there before they do." "You don't understand, Jack," said his voice suddenly hard. "This isn't just about the artifact anymore. You're talking about something far more dangerous than you can imagine. The hunters aren't after just the artifact. They're after everything. They want to take control of it. They want to use it for themselves. You have no idea what kind of power we're dealing with." The old man looked at him, his heart sinking. He had known the stakes were high, but he hadn't fully grasped the scope of what they were facing. "So what are you saying?" Jack asked the woman, her voice tight with tension. "What I'm saying is we can't just steal it and run," he said. "We can't afford to get caught. We need a way to destroy it to make sure no one can ever use it again." The old man's stomach twisted at the thought, but deep down he knew Jack was right. If they didn't destroy it, the artifact would only bring more destruction, more death. "How do we destroy it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jack hesitated before answering. "We need to find the core. It's hidden deep within the facility, but it's heavily guarded. You'll have to find it first, and once you do, you'll need to destroy it from the inside." Destroy it from the inside, the words echoed in the old man's mind, a cold dread settling over him. "We're talking about the very heart of the black site here," he said. "It's not just a building, it's a fortress." Jack nodded. "That's why we need to move fast. We don't have time to waste. We go in, we get the artifact, we destroy the core, and we get out before they realize we were even there." The woman looked at them, both her silver eyes gleaming with determination. "You have the plan. Now we just need to follow through." The old man felt a weight settle on his shoulders, heavier than anything he had ever felt before. This wasn't just a mission. This wasn't just about retrieving the artifact. This was about stopping an unstoppable force from consuming everything they knew, everything they cared about. He turned toward Jack, his old friend, who had been in the trenches with him before, but this time, the stakes were higher than anything they had ever faced. "We do this now," he said, his voice firm and steady. "No more running, no more hiding. We get in, we get out, and we make sure the artifact stays buried forever." Jack nodded slowly, his face grim but resolute. "All right, old man, we do it your way, but you better be ready for what comes next." The woman stood up and stepped toward the door. The time for talking was over now. It was time to act. "Let's go," she said. The door opened with a creak as they stepped into the cold night air once again. The race had begun, and there was no turning back. The air was colder now, the night wrapped around them like a blanket of shadows. As they made their way down the mountain, the old man could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on him with each step. But there was no turning back now. They had come too far to stop. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness as they made their way toward the nearest town, where they would find a safe place to prepare for what was coming. Jack had made it clear that getting to the facility wouldn't be easy, but the old man had trusted him once before, and he would do so again. They had to move quickly. Time was already running out. As they approached the town, the old man kept his eyes peeled for any sign of movement in the distance. He didn't trust the night. The road behind them was a long, dark stretch, and anything could be waiting for them just out of sight. But they had no choice. They couldn't afford to stop. They needed supplies. They needed a plan. "We'll need to resupply," he said, breaking the silence. "I've got a safe house nearby. We can get what we need, and then we head out." Jack didn't respond immediately, his face shadowed by the truck's dashboard lights. His eyes narrowed as if deep in thought. Finally, he spoke. "Don't get too comfortable, old man. This isn't going to be easy. There's a lot we don't know about what's waiting for us once we get inside." The woman didn't speak. She simply watched the road ahead, her expression unreadable. But the old man knew that she was just as determined as he was, even if her silence was deafening. The town was small and quiet. As they pulled into the hidden driveway of the safe house, the old man glanced around once more, scanning the streets as if expecting to see someone or something lurking in the darkness. He didn't trust the peace that surrounded them. It felt wrong, like the calm before a storm. Inside the house, they began gathering what they needed: weapons, supplies, anything that could help them. Once they reached the black site, Jack didn't waste any time, setting up a small map on the table and pointing out their best route. And the old man had been right to trust him. Jack knew what he was talking about, but even with all their preparation, the odds seemed impossible. "We'll need to move fast. Once we're inside," Jack said, his voice low and serious, "we can't afford to waste any time. We get in, we get out, and we make sure the artifact is destroyed." The old man nodded, his mind already moving ahead to the next stage. The plan was clear. But the uncertainty still gnawed at him. They didn't know everything, they didn't know all the guards, they didn't know the full extent of the security systems, or what kind of surprises the hunters might have waiting for them. "We can't fail," he said quietly. "We've come too far to let them win." The woman's eyes met his, her gaze unwavering. "We won't fail," she said softly. "We can do this." Jack looked up from the map, his face tight with tension. "There's no room for mistakes," he said. "The hunters are not like any enemy you faced. Before they'll be expecting us, they'll be prepared. But we have one advantage: they don't know the facility like we do." The woman stepped forward with determination. "We have to take that advantage and use it against them. We can't let them reach the artifact first." The old man looked at her once again, and for the first time, he felt a sense of clarity settle over him. This wasn't just about the artifact, it wasn't just about the mission, it was about something greater. It was about stopping the hunters from using that power to change the world forever. He turned to Jack. "All right, then let's move out, we don't have much time." The truck was loaded and ready to go. The engine roared to life as they pulled away from the safe house, the darkness of the night stretching ahead of them. The old man's heart beat steadily in his chest, but his mind raced with the knowledge of what lay ahead. It was a long drive to the facility, but they had to make it there before the hunters did. As the truck sped down the road, Jack spoke again, his voice tight and focused. "Will be approaching from the east. That's the best route, it's less guarded. The closer we get, the more dangerous it will become. The security systems are far more advanced than anything we've dealt with before." The woman's eyes were already scanning the horizon, as if anticipating what was to come. "We'll be ready," she said firmly. The old man gripped the steering wheel harder as they drove through the night, the road twisting and turning before them, the headlights illuminating only what was directly ahead. He knew that every mile they traveled brought them closer to the black site and closer to whatever awaited them there, but he couldn't afford to think about it too much. They had a job to do, and they couldn't afford to fail, not now. Soon the truck turned off the main road and began its ascent up the mountain. The air grew thinner and colder as they made their way higher up the slope. The winding path ahead was barely visible in the darkness, but the old man pushed forward, his hands steady on the wheel, and his mind focused on the task ahead. "We're almost there," Jack said, his voice tinged with anticipation. The woman turned to face him, her eyes sharp. "We can't afford to waste any more time. They're closer than we think." The old man nodded grimly. "We'll do this together. We'll finish what we started, but we have to move fast, and we have to move smart." The truck continued up the mountain, the night growing darker. Still, as they neared their destination, the tension inside the vehicle was palpable. But there was no turning back now. They had reached the point of no return, and all they could do was press forward. The truck slowed as it neared the hidden entrance, a narrow path barely visible in the darkness, the trees surrounding them thick and oppressive, as if trying to swallow them whole. The air felt charged, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on them like a heavy cloak. The old man kept his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes fixed ahead, despite the pounding of his heart each second, bringing them closer to the black site, closer to the artifact and the danger that awaited. "We're almost there," Jack said, his voice tight with anticipation, his fingers tapping on the map laid out in front of him. "We can't waste any more time. We need to get inside and reach the artifact before they do." The woman didn't respond. Her gaze was fixed on the road ahead, but the old man could sense the focus in her every movement, her every breath, the calm before the storm. He shifted the truck into gear and eased it forward, the wheels crunching over the gravel as they began the final stretch of their journey. The narrow path twisted sharply, and the trees grew thicker, casting long shadows over the road. They drove in silence, the tension building with every turn, every bump in the road. The old man felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as they passed a dense cluster of trees. Something didn't feel right, the air felt wrong. But he couldn't put his finger on why. He glanced over at Jack, who was already scanning the surrounding area, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow as if expecting an ambush. "What is it?" the old man asked, his voice low but urgent. Jack didn't respond immediately, his face pale in the dim light of the truck's dashboard. "We're being watched," he muttered under his breath. "I don't like this." The old man's pulse quickened as his grip on the wheel tightened. "Are they hunters?" he asked. Jack nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. "We can't afford to get caught up here. They're too close." The woman shifted in her seat, her eyes glowing in the darkness. As she scanned the path ahead, "We need to keep moving, we can't stop here." The old man nodded, his jaw tight. As he pushed the truck forward, the trees grew even denser as they moved deeper into the mountain, past the road narrowing even more, until it was little more than a winding trail, barely wide enough for the truck to fit through. But they had no choice, they couldn't turn back now. "We're almost there," Jack repeated the words, almost a mantra, as he pointed to a small clearing just ahead. "That's where we make our move. We'll need to disarm the security systems from the inside. Then we can get to the artifact." The old man nodded sharply, his mind already racing through the steps they needed to take. They couldn't afford any mistakes this time. The hunters were closing in, and if they were caught, they wouldn't survive. They reached the clearing and the truck came to a stop. Jack was out of the vehicle in an instant, moving with practiced speed to the edge of the clearing. He dropped to one knee and began to scan the area, his hand moving over a small device that blinked softly in the dark, his eyes flicking from side to side as he surveyed the surroundings. "It's quiet," Jack said, after a moment. "Too quiet." "We've been followed," the old man muttered. "I can feel it." "We need to move quickly," the woman said, her voice cutting through the tension in the air. "They're closer than you think." The old man grabbed the map from the dashboard and jumped out of the truck, scanning the area for any sign of the entrance to the black site. He saw nothing at first, just trees and the narrow path leading into the mountainside, but then his eyes caught a flicker of movement off to the side in the shadows, and he motioned for Jack to follow. "There they are," he said, his voice low and urgent. Jack didn't hesitate. He followed the old man into the underbrush, moving with speed and precision, his eyes darting around as if expecting an attack from every direction. They reached the base of the mountain, where a large steel door was set into the rock face. The door was hidden from view by the thick trees, but the old man knew exactly where it was. They had used this entrance before, back when they had worked together years ago. "It's locked," Jack said, his voice strained as he worked quickly with the device in his hands. "Hurry," the old man growled, "we don't have much time." With a final click, the door slid open, and they were inside the cold concrete walls of the black site, the air thick with the smell of metal and stale air. They had made it past the first line of security, but they were far from safe. "We need to split up," Jack said, his voice tense. "We'll cover more ground that way." The old man nodded. "I'll head for the artifact, you get the core." The woman stepped forward. "I'll stay with you." They moved quickly through the facility, the flickering lights casting long shadows on the walls, a silence oppressive as they crept through the hallways, each step bringing them closer to their goal. The old man could feel the weight of the artifact pulling at him, urging him to hurry. But he knew better than to rush. They had to stay focused. They had to be precise. The hall seemed empty, but the old man knew better. They had been discovered before they even entered the facility. They could be surrounded at any moment, but he kept moving forward, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead. "Keep your guard up," Jack warned from behind. "They'll be here soon." The old man nodded, his heart racing as they approached the room where the artifact was kept. He could feel its power, even from a distance. It was a presence that seemed to hum in the air around them. They were close. The old man's breath quickened as they rounded the final corner, his eyes fixed on the door at the end of the hall. He knew what lay behind it. The artifact was close, and the moment he touched it, everything would change. But he couldn't afford to hesitate. They had come this far, and failure wasn't an option. The woman moved beside him, her pace steady, and focused, her eyes scanning every corner as they approached the door. Jack's voice crackled over the comms. "Stay alert. They know you're there. The hunters are moving in." The old man nodded without speaking. The silence of the hall was oppressive. The only sound was the soft click of his boots against the cold concrete floor. He reached the door and paused, his hand resting on the handle. He could feel the artifact's presence on the other side. It was a force like nothing he had ever encountered, a power that had the potential to change the course of everything. "This is it," the woman whispered, her voice low but filled with determination. He nodded and turned the handle. The door creaked open, and they stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with an unnatural energy. The artifact sat on a pedestal in the center of the room, its surface shimmering with a strange light. It looked almost alive, pulsating with a rhythm that seemed to resonate with the old man's heartbeat. "It's beautiful," he whispered, but there was no time for admiration. Jack's voice came through again. "They're right behind you, hurry." The old man moved toward the artifact, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for it. But as his fingers brushed the surface, a low hum filled the room. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, and a blinding light erupted from the artifact, illuminating the entire room. "Get away from it," the woman shouted, but it was too late. The light intensified, and the air around them seemed to warp as if reality itself was bending in response to the artifact's power. The old man stumbled back, his hand still hovering over the artifact's surface, but the woman grabbed his arm, pulling him away from it. "We need to go now," Jack warned again. "The hunters are almost here." But the old man couldn't move, not yet. The artifact was too powerful, too dangerous. To simply leave behind it was calling to him, whispering promises of power and knowledge, but he knew better than to trust it. "We destroy it," he said, his voice steady and firm. "This thing has to be destroyed." The woman's eyes flicked to the pedestal, her face hardening as she nodded, but the moment of hesitation was enough. The door to the room slammed open, and a group of armed soldiers rushed inside, their weapons raised. The old man's heart dropped as he saw the hunters emerge from the shadows. They were fast, their movements precise and deadly. "You're too late," one of the hunters sneered. "We've already won." The old man didn't hesitate. He moved swiftly, reaching for a device at his belt. It was a detonator. He had been carrying it for years, knowing that if the time ever came, he would need it to destroy the artifact, no matter the cost. He pressed the button, and the entire facility shook with the force of the explosion. The room filled with a deafening roar as the walls began to crumble. The hunters scattered at the old man, and the woman stood firm, watching as the light from the artifact flickered and faded. The room was collapsing around them, but there was nothing left to do but survive. "We have to get out of here," Jack shouted from the comms. "The whole place is coming down. We won't make it if we stay here." The old man nodded and turned to the woman. "We've done what we came here to do. Now let's get out." They sprinted toward the door, the ground shaking beneath them as the walls cracked and buckled. The ceiling above them groaned and collapsed in places, but they kept running through the debris and the dust, their lungs burning with each breath. The exit was close now, just a few more turns, and they would be free. But the hunters weren't done yet. They had caught up and were closing in from every direction. They had to fight their way out. The old man grabbed the weapon he had stashed in the back of his jacket and turned to face the approaching soldiers. The woman did the same, their eyes locked with a shared understanding. They wouldn't let the hunters stop them. They fought through the chaos, the hunters' weapons flashing in the dim light, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. They had to be quick and precise if they were going to make it out alive. As they reached the final stretch of the hallway, Jack's voice came through the comms again. "They're blocking the exit. You have to move now." The old man cursed under his breath, but there was no time to waste. He grabbed the woman's arm and pulled her toward a nearby service door. It led to the lower levels where the escape tunnels were located. It was their only chance. They ran through the narrow corridors, a sound of footsteps echoing in the distance, but the hunters were still behind them. The old man could hear their voices closing in, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. They reached the tunnel entrance, and the door slammed shut behind them, just as the facility's collapse reached its peak. "We're alive," the old man breathed, but just barely. The woman looked at him, her expression unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of gratitude, or perhaps something more. They had survived, but the war was far from over. The hunters would come for them again, and they would be ready.